talk a little bit about how does that compare to the ACT, then talk about the SAT, what's changed, how they score, what the structure is for it. Similar with the ACT, although nothing's really changed recently. And then one of the big questions we get is which test should I take and how you should think about that and how you should approach that when you get to that point. And then any other additional topics. I don't know if there's other things that you guys want to cover, or as we go, whatever questions you have. We're a relatively small group, so don't hesitate to raise your hand, ask for us to go deeper. And if it's really nuanced, we'll probably just take it offline and do it at the end of the presentation. But most of the questions will apply to most of the folks in this room, I'm sure. So I always want to remind folks, because they think about the SAT and this almighty test, that it's just one part of your overall college application. So there's your academics, so your 9th, 10th, 11th grade, and then most of your 12th grade year that you should consider, and planning for that early is really important. There's a standardized test, whether it's the SAT or the ACT or SAT 2 test, which we'll talk a little bit about as well. That part of your profile, what extracurricular activities that you participate in, and then finally your college applications, that last step of putting that all together. So when people get overwhelmed, it's important to remember that this is just one part of that mosaic, and it's actually, frankly, not even the most important part. The most important part are the academics and that track record over the 3 years, but it is certainly a component that matters. So today, like I said, we're really just talking about standardized tests and that piece of your college application. So SAT versus ACT. So lots of folks worry about this a lot. The new SAT is it's changed in lots of ways, which we'll talk about a little bit. But by and large, it looks more like the ACT now than it did previously. So the differences between the two have gotten smaller than anything, and we'll talk about how they still are different. And the other thing that's changed in the last 10 years, which is important for everyone in this room, especially as you have students, it's different than if your parents applied and when they applied to school, is that every school in the country takes the ACT now as well. And they view both the tests similarly when you submit them to school. Most schools don't have a preference for ACT or SAT. They just want to see where you line up relatively. So figuring out which test you're going to do better on is important in that way. So the SAT does not have a science section, while the ACT does. The thing about the ACT science section is that you don't actually have to have any scientific knowledge, but you need to be good at interpreting data and graphs and comfortable with scientific content. And not everyone is. Sometimes that throws students off. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now for both tests, the essay is optional, although the essays are slightly different. So in the SAT, the optional essay asks you to evaluate an argument, the passage that they give you in that argument, and to take a side on that. And then on the ACT, it's to develop and support an argument. So they're just two different types of essays. And they're both optional. They obviously extend the test. We can talk a little bit later about, would you or wouldn't you take those? Why would you do that? One place that the SAT and ACT do differ a fair amount is on the math sections. So as you probably know, the SAT now has fill in the blank math. So sometimes they don't give you multiple choices. You have to actually get the correct answer. And they also have one of the sections doesn't allow a calculator. The ACT allows a calculator on all the questions, and they're all multiple choice. And we'll talk a little bit about how those differ as well. And the SAT is far less time intensive, and the ACT is more time intensive. So for students who can get through work quickly, the ACT sometimes is better. But that's by and large at the high level how they differ. And at the end of the questions, yeah, the ACT is more time intensive than the SAT. So your average time per question on the ACT is about 50 seconds. On the SAT, it's about a minute and 10 seconds. So the ACT questions, as a result, tend to be a little less complex, although there's more of them than the SAT questions. So that's just a comparison. At the end, we'll go through a decision tree about how you think about it, go into a little bit more depth about how these two tests differ. Any questions on this that anybody has? Yeah.
When I was younger, I don't know if it's still true, but it was more like ACT was more Midwest, West Coast, and SAT was more Northeast Coast. Is that still true, or are they, because of the new one, is the vision of it different now?
Yeah, so I would say over the there's a couple of things that have happened, and we'll talk a little bit about this, but the SAT has lost a lot of market share to the ACT. So I grew up in Kentucky. In Kentucky, everyone took the ACT, at least who's my age, and no one really took the SAT, and everyone in the Northeast took the SAT, and they didn't really take the ACT. That was partly because Northeast schools and schools on the coast tended to take the SAT, and schools in the Midwest and South tended to take the ACT, and had a preference for one or the other. That preference has essentially gone away over the last 15 years, and they'll take either one, and they don't really have a preference on which test you take. So I would say it's still true that if you looked at market share in different geographies like you're talking about, that more people would take the ACT in the Midwest and South still, and more people would take the SAT here and a little bit on the West Coast at this point. But it doesn't really matter. It should be more about what's best for your student, what do they feel more comfortable with, and what's the best to optimize their potential outcome on that. Yeah?
Just a quick question about optional essay.
Yeah.
Everybody does the essay, right? Is it really optional?
It is really optional. You don't have to do the essay. It really depends on there's certain schools where they want you to do the essay, and there's certain schools where they don't. It really depends where you're applying. And we'll talk a little bit about, actually we won't, but like sometimes super scores and things like that come in as well. So it's really important if you think, okay, here are my subset of schools that I want to apply to, and what do they require in terms of the SAT or the ACT? Do they require that essay? I always tell, but like if you just take a step back and say like, should I take it or not? It really depends on, are you a good writer under time pressure, right? And if you are, it's another opportunity to show colleges what you're capable of doing. If you're not, then it's probably best to skip it. It really just depends on the student and their capabilities.
And once you take it, that's where you have to submit that. You could take it, find out how you did on that part, and decide not to submit that part.
Well, it depends on what type of school you're applying to again, right? So some schools want to see every test you've ever taken, right? Like a Yale wants to see every test you've ever taken, and some schools don't, right? So you can choose not to submit that score, including the writing part to schools.
It tends to be a correlation between like highly selective schools are more likely to ask for total transparency,
That's
right?
right. Yeah, because they're trying to differentiate students, right? And that's a way of differentiating. Did someone have a trajectory up to a 1600, or did they get a 1600 the first time, right? That matters to a school where they're really trying to figure out ways to eliminate students, not accept students. Yeah.
Is the essay scored, or is it just a sample?
It's not scored in like the 800 scale. It's a different scoring system for that. So like for the SAT, it's we'll talk about the scoring a little bit. You'll have the 2 sections out of 800, and the SAT essay is a separate thing. And on the ACT, it's not scored in that way. Yeah. Any other questions? So often people ask like, why did they redesign the SAT? So if you think about like the history of the SAT a bit, most of the parents took the kind of original 1600 version. That was a slightly harder test than the current test. They originally changed that in 1995 and made it a little bit easier. So the version I took was slightly easier in 2000. And then about 10, 11 years ago, they changed it to the 2400 version, with some of the students and parents might be familiar with. So then they had 3 sections out of 800 and made it slightly different. One of the things that happened was that I alluded to before is that the SAT lost a lot of market share. Ultimately, the College Board is a business, right? And they want to have market share in order to stay relevant. And they lost a lot of market share to the ACT. And there's a couple reasons they did. One was that the test, the SAT, is supposed to be a judge of how well you're going to do in college and how prepared you are for college. And it turned out that the new SAT that they created at 2400 wasn't a great predictor of college success, or at least not a good enough predictor of college success. And the ACT, frankly, just was a better predictor. So what they wanted to do was say, okay, how do we change this where we change things like the obscure passages, irrelevant vocabulary, all this stuff to make it more like the work that students are doing in high school and more like the work that they're going to do in college, so it's a better predictor. So there's a business decision of why they did that, and then the ramifications of why they did that. So the test looks different than it did 9-10 months ago now as a result. So just talk a little bit more about this. So it's now 1600 point exam again, out of 800 on both sections. The math and then the verbal, which is evidence-based reading, and the writing test. So that part contains reading comprehensive and English writing. There's the optional essay, and doesn't affect your overall 1600 point score. So it's more like the 1600 point score that we all remember. The one thing that is slightly different is right now they're collecting data to see how those scores look over time. And for the first set of data, the scores are inflated by about 90 points relative to what they anticipated them being. The average is about 1090 on the SAT right now, and it used to be about 1,000. That's what they always want the average to be around. So they're making some adjustments to drive that average to 1,000. The thing that's important for is college admissions is figuring out exactly what to do with the set of scores that are coming out now and collecting that data.
So there'll still be a focus on percentile, which won't change as dramatically as the raw score will.
Right.
Either way.
That's right. So there's 3 different scores. So you have your 800 points for reading and writing, 800 for math. There's these sub-scores, which are how you're doing in different topics. These are really useful from a tutoring perspective, right? So we can see, are you doing well on harder algebra? Are you doing well at problem solving, data analysis? Where do you have these gaps? Colleges aren't considering these scores as of yet. These are really just a tool to figure out where do I need to put in time, where do I need to put in the work, where do I have gaps, either in content or knowledge or capability, whatever it happens to be. And then the cross-test scores as well. So there's 2 different cross-test scores. This is kind of in response to the ACT, which has been doing this for a while. There's analysis in history and social studies and analysis in science. Again, it's kind of see how you apply